Today we're going to get into a really powerful idea from the 16th century, one that completely changed how millions of people experience their faith. And it all comes down to John Calvin's radical argument against using images in places of worship.
You know, have you ever noticed this? You can walk into one church and it's just filled with these incredible statues and beautiful paintings. But then you go into another one, maybe right down the street, and it's just plain, bare white walls. What is going on there? What's the reason for such a huge difference?
Well, a huge piece of that puzzle, a big part of the answer, goes all the way back to this one guy, John Calvin. The arguments he made, they were like a theological shockwave, and you can still feel the effects today in how these places of worship look and feel all over the world.
So, let's break down his thinking. Calvin's whole case is built on a few key pillars. And the very first one, it comes straight from his reading of Scripture.
I mean, listen to how absolute that is. For Calvin, this was the bottom line. No two ways about it. God is an invisible, infinite spirit. So trying to box him into a physical object, a piece of wood, some stone, or paint, that wasn't just not good enough. It was an outright lie. A lie that actually corrupted and dishonored who God is.
And this right here perfectly illustrates his key piece of evidence, which he pulls from the book of Deuteronomy. Think about it. When God revealed himself at Mount Horeb, what did the people get? They got a voice. They heard commands. They heard words. But what did they see? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No shape, no body, no form. And for Calvin, that wasn't an accident. That was the whole point. God is meant to be heard, not seen.
For Calvin, it just came down to basic logic. He's basically asking, how on earth can you make a physical statue of something that has no body? How do you paint a picture of something that's literally invisible? How can you possibly represent an infinite, immeasurable spirit with a small, finite piece of wood or stone? It just didn't make sense. To him, any attempt was just a complete, absurd contradiction.
Okay, so this idea about God's nature flows right into his next major point. And here he shifts gears a little. He goes from talking about the nature of God to talking about the nature of us. He's digging into the very wiring of the human mind.
And this quote is maybe one of his most famous, a perpetual factory of idols. What a metaphor, right? He really believed that our minds are just constantly churning out these tangible gods. We get uncomfortable with a deity we can't see, one that's purely spiritual. So it's like we're hardwired to just invent physical things we can actually see and touch instead. And he saw this playing out in a really predictable, almost a four-step process. First, it all starts in the mind. We dare to imagine a God we can wrap our heads around. Second, the hand gets involved and gives birth to that idea, making it a physical idol. Then, step 3, people start to believe that God is somehow in the object. And from there, step 4 is inevitable. You start adoring the object itself.
And this is such a crucial point in his whole argument. For Calvin, it literally doesn't matter if you say you're worshiping the object as God or if you say you're just worshiping God through the object. He's saying the end result is the same. Either way, you're giving divine honor to a physical thing, and that act pulls your focus away from the true and visible God. The act itself is idolatry, period.
Now, of course, Calvin wasn't just shouting into the void here. He was directly taking on the biggest, most common argument that people used to defend having all these images in churches.
And this was the classic defense. You've probably heard it. It was made famous centuries earlier by Pope Gregory the Great. The idea was, hey, most people can't read, so images acted like books for the uneducated. They were basically a visual Bible for folks who were illiterate. And, on the surface, that sounds pretty reasonable, doesn't it? Yeah, well, not to Calvin. He comes right back at them with Scripture, quoting the prophet Habakkuk. He's basically saying, you call it a book of truth? No way. A man-made image can only ever be a teacher of falsehood. Why? Because, as we just talked about, it fundamentally lies about who God is.
And then he takes it even one step further. He pretty much flips the whole argument on its head. He says the very fact that there are so many uneducated people is the church's own fault. If the church had just done its job and taught people the word properly, you wouldn't need these fake books in the first place.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, and it's a super important distinction to make. Calvin wasn't anti-art. Not at all. His argument was way more nuanced than that. And to see why, we have to look at this very subtle defense his opponents were using. So the people defending images, they had this very clever distinction they'd make based on two different Greek words. They'd say, look, we only give latria,
That's true, hardcore worship and adoration to God and God alone. Everything else, the saints, the images, the relics, they just get dulia. That's a lower kind of honor, more like veneration or service.
Calvin's response to that? He thought it was just a word game. He called it a childish contradiction. He argued that if you look at the Bible, the words for service and worship are used interchangeably all the time. For him, the label didn't matter. What mattered was the action, and what people were actually doing in front of these statues. Well, it looked a heck of a lot like worship, no matter what you decided to call it.
And this is what really gets the heart of his actual position. Calvin thought art, painting, sculpture, was a gift from God. He had no problem with art that depicted things our eyes can actually see. You want to paint a historical event? Great. A portrait of a person? Go for it. A landscape? Beautiful. Art can be for instruction or just for pleasure. But he had one single, non-negotiable rule: do not use it to try and represent God's majesty, and don't use it in worship.
All right, so for his final point, Calvin had to go back in time. He had to deal with the fact that venerating images had deep historical roots, and that meant he had to take on a major historic church council.
So he goes and reads the official records from the Second Council of Nicaea. This was the council back in the 8th century that officially endorsed using images. And honestly, he was just appalled. He thought their use of scripture was ridiculous. For example, they take this line, "No one lights a lantern and puts it under a bushel," and they use that to argue that therefore you should put images on altars. Calvin just read that and thought it was completely childish, totally nonsensical.
And just to give you a sense of the intensity of what Calvin was arguing against, you have to hear this. This is a real, actual quote from a delegate at that very council. He said, "It would be better to allow brothels into a city than to forbid the worship of images." I mean, wow. When you hear that, you start to understand just how passionately these images were being defended. And it helps explain why Calvin's own response was so forceful.
So you see, for Calvin, this wasn't some dry academic debate. After looking at all the evidence, his conclusion was clear. The council's arguments weren't just wrong. They were built on foolishness and, in his mind, blasphemy. He saw it as the ultimate proof that the church had gone way off track from true spiritual religion.
And the takeaway? Well, the impact was absolutely huge. This is the why behind all those bare walls we talked about at the beginning. Calvin's powerful, complex argument became the theological blueprint for a tradition that stripped churches of their images. It created a form of worship focused entirely on the Word, on what you can hear and understand, not on what you can see.
And that leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? I mean, Calvin was writing 500 years ago, but his central challenge feels maybe more relevant today than ever before. We live in a world that is just saturated with images, with visual media everywhere. So how do we relate to what can't be seen? How do we find meaning in something that is, by its very nature, invisible?